Good morning, everybody. The economy, world economy, local economy. I was in Davos recently. You know, somebody's been to Davos. It's like somebody who's got an MBA, they tell you. So I was in Davos recently, and the mood in Davos was incredibly positive. Everybody, Donald Trump walked in. The people were hailing him as the great savior of the US economy. Barack Obama this week then tweeted a photograph of a document that he'd signed to liberate the US economy in 11 years ago and said, no, it was me, not Donald Trump. But we're headed for another 4 years of Donald Trump. Are we headed for another 4 years of expansion? Certainly, coronavirus is a big concern. In South Africa, we've got big problems. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I've got some skin on some of the panelists, but not all. Roelof Botha is the master of the fine joke. Elmien is, I don't know any skinner on Elmien. She doesn't have skinner. Prince Mashele, my favorite Prince Mashele joke, story. Just after the new government was appointed, we had a new president and a deputy president, and we had a public enterprises minister who hadn't had time to go to the offices yet, and we at a conference, and he stands up, there's Prince Mashele at this conference, and he goes, "We've got a new deputy president. Who knows who he is?" And somebody goes, Mabuza? He says, "Yeah, DD Mabuza. Do you know what DD stands for?" And some poor twit in the audience goes, "David?" "No!" he says, "Dodgy and dangerous." You can make up your own mind if he's right or not. Wandile Sihlobo is an author. He won't tell you that himself. His book is coming out 2 weeks after mine. All about land reform. And then the former chief executive, as of 2 days ago at Agri, Chris Venter. If there's time, we'll ask him why. We like a good Skinner story. He'll be the 42nd CEO of a prominent company in the last year to quit. Some had to be pushed. Peter Moyer still doesn't know that he's not required at Old Mutual. Anyway, when I was in Davos, what we did was go to lots of panel discussions, and often in South Africa, we give people 3 minutes to give a point of view. We don't have 3 minutes. We've got 30 seconds. I think we'll start with Chris. You can start on that side. And the most pertinent topic on your mind right now in 30 seconds or less. Chris Venter, you go first.
Thank you, Bruce. I think, first of all, I'm not going to talk about why I left, so thanks for that.
That's 10 seconds done.
The permanent question is sticking to the area that the industry I know, and what's worrying me is more food security. So the issue for me in food security is long term. We go from year to year, and we try, the one we don't have rain. If you look at the trend analysis over the 20 years, you can see a specific shift in terms of rainfall. And I'm not seeing necessarily the preparation from almost a public governance point of view.
Yeah, that's your 30 seconds done.
How do we work on that? Thanks, Bruce, but you
is.
took most of my 30 seconds.
Your 30 seconds are up. That's how strict the rule is. And of course, there are locusts that are being blown south as well, which is a big concern. Wandile, you know the rules are tough. Your 30 seconds start now.
I would say on my 30 seconds, the areas of growth or of expansion in South African agricultural sector will really be the Eastern Cape, KZN, and part of Limpopo. So if you're sitting here and you're really thinking about expanding, and I think taking into consideration new technologies, what Chris was talking about on food security, I think those provinces should be the primary focus. And you will be solving poverty and unemployment.
And you allowed Tito Mboweni to do some informal farming, and everything else to be sorted out. Prince Mashele, 30 seconds.
The question that South Africans must...
your 30 seconds haven't started yet. Okay. Your microphone is picking up the blinking of your eye rather than the words that are coming out.
Shift it down.
Put your microphone down. There we go.
Does it work now?
No, but that's fine, because it's fallen off your ear. That's why. Okay, while you sort that out, or somebody comes and helps you sort that out, Elmien, your 30 seconds.
So my focus is on the law, obviously, and I'm quite interested in the constitutional amendment process. So I want...
You carry on. Carry on. I can do this. I can multitask. I'm a man.
I see my role as ensuring that this constitutional amendment, if it goes through in terms of the constitution. So as far as I'm concerned, what can be an influence on the economy, there is one of three options. We can either have the amendment in front of the National Assembly and it doesn't get the required two-thirds majority, which at the moment seems plausible. We can have it fall through and it goes to the yes, the right, or we can have a pragmatic solution where we make explicit what is implicit, and that's not an amendment but a clarification to move on.
Which is common sense.
Where do I start?
Roelof, Botha in 30 seconds.
Right.
Let's try.
My passion is with job creation, and I've been fortunate enough and privileged to be involved with several job creation projects in my life. It is the single biggest problem in this country, unemployment, and if you analyze the SONA, the president seems to agree with me. Easiest way to kickstart jobs is to lower the cost of capital. We need a deep, very deep cut in interest rates in this country. And then there are, in this country, dozens of employer organizations and hundreds of thousands of highly skilled professionals, many of whom have retired, and they're sitting at home painting the garage door, that can come to the party and assist government because they don't have the skills.
Lovely. Well, the people who have got the skills painting the garage doors, government doesn't have the skills, just clarifying.
That's what I was saying.
I know, you're very good at that. Prince,
Okay, let's try. Does it work now?
I hope so.
Okay. My focus now is how do we save South Africa from a collapsing liberation movement that has reached its sell-by date? If you look at the ANC, everything in South Africa is collapsing. Why? Because the ANC is collapsing. Society must answer the question, how do we save ourselves from this monster so that it doesn't collapse with us? That's my focus.
What a wonderful contribution. I mean, but that's popular. Look at that. It's a smattering of applause. Now, one thing I've learned in big rooms like this is it's impossible to take questions from the floor with any level of decorum or decency or control. So if you would like questions to the panel, I would love you to put them through me, please. At Bruce Business on Twitter is the easiest way of doing it. So Twitter, at Bruce Business. It's the way I get extra followers. It's the only way that I can get to do that. So if you can put your questions via me, and I most certainly will do my very best to ensure that your question is put to the panel this morning. I'm opening my application, and I'm ready for your questions. Right, let's maybe pick up on the big elephant in the room, which is land and land restitution and land redistribution. I mean, let's focus on your point to start off with, and that is this issue of Section 25 of the Constitution, amendments to the Constitution. It's a little bit like government or COSATU wanting to dip into the PIC pension fund, saying we'll only take 7% to bail out to bail out Eskom. And it's when you open a tube of Pringles, you have one Pringle. And once you pop, you can't stop. And you can just imagine the PIC being denuded because it becomes an easy source of money. Changing the constitution for land becomes a little bit like that. Once it suits us to change the constitution for a very popular cause, the entire constitution is at risk of a populist takeover, potentially. Is that your concern?
My biggest concern is how did we get here in the first place? And we got here in the first place because for 25 years nothing has been done in the area of land reform, or that what has been done is I think it's fair to say it's almost in a total collapse. So people, while land is not high up on the list, I will agree probably unemployment, education is higher up on the list. It makes it a very viable thing to catch on to have populist conversations about. So for me, what we are also having at the moment is a conversation of, is this constitution working for us? And a lot of people say, no, it isn't. And a lot of people say, well, it can. It's about the implementation. So we are having that interaction there.
When we talk about is the constitution working for us, I suppose it depends which us is speaking at any particular time.
Well, I think the idea of land redistribution, of equal land holding, is the benefit of all of us in South Africa. I think there's a big risk in it not being addressed. So
Correct.
It is in all our interest to have an orderly land reform where land is equally or at least fairly distributed amongst us all. For me, I see this as actually a positive place because we are testing the Constitution, and it seems to be that the Constitution is withstanding the test of time in the sense that the ad hoc committee's mandate is very, very restricted. They can only make explicit what is implicit in the Constitution. So they don't have a broad mandate to change the Constitution. And if we can get to a stage where we only make explicit, as a lawyer that irritates me because we make explicit in legislation, not by changing the Constitution, but the Constitution being a political document can
Yeah.
also have a political drive to change it. But if we only get to a stage where we make explicit, we are not changing the law. We are
Clarifying.
clarifying and we are recalibrating the social contract that we did 25 years ago. And if that goes that way, which is a pragmatic way in a sense as well, I think we can sit back and tell ourselves the Constitution withstood this test of time.
Okay. Wandile Sihlobo, you've given up a year of your life that you're never going to get back on the Presidential Advisory Panel on land. Is what Elmien talking about, I mean, have we moved beyond what Elmien is talking about? Or can sanity prevail? And I'll get you now, Prince, who's champing at the bit. You want to jump in about the logic of politics. But can sanity prevail, or are we almost certain to go down to a constitutional amendment?
I mean, this is obviously a political question, but I think that we're still on a 50-50 basis stuff. Because the ANC themselves, they cannot really change the constitution. They don't have enough votes. You have the EFF, which cannot, the DA cannot. So either DA or EFF has to vote with the ANC in order to be able to have that clarification. But obviously we've given time thinking about this and published work as a collective. But I think if I think as an individual, on an economic basis stuff, the key things that you're really looking at is what Dr. Botha was alluding to. And I wonder then if changing only the constitution without thinking more about firstly strengthening your institutional reform, you will be able to deliver anything. But I think let's think more, how do we strengthen the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform, and Rural Development? Is there any land supply that is out there that can actually be put into use before actually moving on this path? And the answer to that is yes. So I think those interventions, but I think also given that South Africa is in the mood of a social compacting where private sector, government is coming together, initiatives like what Chris is going to be starting, those things, I think that's what we should be focusing on. But I wonder if merely focusing on a change in the constitution would deliver much. I don't think
The trouble is you get more points, don't you, Prince, in the world of politics for making big, bold, meaningless changes, unnecessary changes, than you do for doing hard work. Because that's all hard work. Much easier just to get a vote through Parliament to change the Constitution and wreak havoc. I mean, Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, yesterday warning very, very strongly the Trump administration would view this as the beginning of the end of the South African economy. Get you in a moment, Roelof.
Okay. It is said, or it is alleged, that we have one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, right? And the Constitution states very clearly that we need to deal with historic injustice as it applies to the economy. In other words, we must empower black people economically. So it is written in black and white, it's in the Constitution. The question is, has that happened? The answer is no. So we are talking about amending Section 25. Let's say it gets amended this year. The question is, what will happen after the amendment? That's the real question. I know that the majority of black people after the amendment will not get land. I know that there will be no mass of black agronomists after the amendment. So we're really talking words here, maybe poetry. We're not talking the real stuff that move and change society. And that's the problem when you have a bunch of clowns like we have now running a country. What they do, they chase poetry in terms of chasing the substance that changes society. If you wanted to redistribute land in a meaningful way, the ANC was supposed to tell us, over the past 25 years, we have trained so many black agronomists. These people are skilled, they are capable of farming commercially. They don't have land. We want to give them land. Don't tell me that you want to amend Section 25 and then you end up with a Zimbabwe.
Yeah, but that rule of word, I mean, Mike Pompeo's statement is the point of this. It's a case of the rule of law must stand. If you tinker with the rule of law, you then create the uncertainty, which then says to everybody, don't go near that place. So in Davos, in a very, very small room with investors, there were like 6 people, and each one of them was saying, please stop chopping and changing the rules, please make sure there's electricity, and could we have some clean water, please, and can you keep our executives safe when they're in your country, and then everything's fine. But we keep sending signals, and I mean, in economics, I suppose signals are more important than anything else.
Yes, well, I think it's terribly important for everybody in the room here to realize that I'd say that 90% of the mess that we're in right now was caused by the lost years, as Mr. Ramaphosa refers to it diplomatically. Trevor Manuel is less diplomatic. He's a little bit more like me. He says that the Zuma era was the worst disaster in the history of this country. Now, Mr. Zuma thinks it's Jan van Riebeeck.
Which history? I mean, in the recent history, perhaps, but let's not have that
10 seconds. I disagree with Mr. Zuma on that score. Just getting back, I mean, I'd like to just make sure that we follow up on Chris's statement in the beginning, and that's food security, long-term thinking of food security. But getting back to this issue of land reform, you know the definition of a communist? It's somebody who's got nothing, but he wants to share it with you. And nationalization is an unmitigated disaster. I agree with Prince wholeheartedly on that score. Now, I've got good news for the delegates here, and that if anybody can go to the trouble of communicating with Liesel, lovely Liesel de Villiers, I will be most pleased to send you the executive summary of an econometric assessment, which I did with Prof. Ilse Botha from UJ, which in the old days Rao. No nepotism here. She was from Rensburg 30 years ago, best student I ever had, maar sy het reg getrou. And it's we did this clinically. We didn't ask ourselves whether it's right or wrong and stuff like that. We just said, okay, what will happen to the economy if they start taking away, you know, if they implement expropriation without comprehension? I mean, because it's the same thing, quite frankly, and it would be an unmitigated disaster. We quantified this, and I would be delighted to share the executive summary with everybody.
I do wonder whether facts matter in this debate. I mean, Elmien?
I just want to, you know, when we are in this conversation, it's very difficult, especially from a legal perspective. We deal with words, and specific words matter. So I've now termed it expropriation without compensation, which is nonsense, because there is not a legal thing like expropriation without compensation.
That's because it's illegal, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm fine that we are now using that term broadly, but we must also distinguish between EWOC, meaning expropriation without compensation, meaning nationalization, which is not the ANC's policy, and it meaning expropriation without compensation, which is confiscation. And then the nuance that I think Section 25.3 brings in, that says compensation must be just and equitable. So our compensation standard remains just and equitable, and it's a contextual question. And then with a weighing up of factors, and that in very limited circumstances, that process of looking what is just and equitable, weighing up those factors, can land on 0 rand. So I think, you know, we conflate these issues without certainty, also because the ANC is not communicating effectively with what they mean when they speak about expropriation without
compensation. The ANC doesn't know what it means, and that's ultimately the problem.
They're told what it means.
10.3 million people, Prince, don't give a damn about this conversation. 10.3 million people can't find a bloody job. 10.3 million people have no vision of a future that they can see. 10.3 million people are understandably a bit irritated by the circumstances in which they find themselves. And that's really the issue. And it's the Prof's issue as well.
How did we get there?
Yeah.
That 10.3 million people are unemployed. Let me summarize you the long history of South Africa in 2 minutes. Number one, we have had 3 governments running South Africa. That is modern South Africa. We have had the English. When they ran South Africa, they made money out of mining, and they used mining to empower their own people who lived in South Africa. That's the first government. The second government is the government of Afrikaners. When they took over, they used agriculture and they used state-owned companies to empower their own people, and they took their own people to school. And they created jobs for their people. And then we have had a black government, which is the ANC. Show me the factories that the black government has created or an industry that the black government has created. It hasn't. Because the chaps who are sitting in Little House have no clue what it means to run a factory. Now, that's why there are people are unemployed. That's how we got here. That's why the 10 million people are not interested in the discussion, because they know everything that Ramaphosa said in Parliament, it's not going to create a job for a black guy who is in a village somewhere. That's the truth, an unfortunate sad reality of South Africa.
Wandile?
No, I mean, I'm not going to debate on Prince's assessment, but I would say at this point, the temperature has somewhat changed. There's private sector coming to the table saying, hey, government, can we work together on certain things? There's a whole range of master plans that are being developed. There are institutions that are thinking of working with the government, particularly on agriculture and also in other industries. So I wouldn't necessarily say we are now much more at a trap, but I think that the difficulties of today have managed to put everybody on the table to think progressively about what could actually happen.
Sometimes you need a crisis to force a different way of thinking. And we are most certainly in a crisis. But Rassie Erasmus understands South Africa's unemployment crisis better, I think, than our government does. It was at the end of the Rugby World Cup, and he was asked whether or not it was very stressful coming through the World Cup. He says, no, winning a Rugby World Cup's not stressful. Stress is not having a job. It was the most remarkable summation of South Africa's problem, Roelof, and it is your number one concern and priority.
Yes, absolutely. You know, these 10.3 million people, we just have to look at the facts, dig a little bit deeper. I'm guessing that at least, and this is a guesstimate, 85% of them are unemployable. You talk about the fourth industrial revolution, for crying in a bucket, they don't know what the first industrial revolution is. I mean, they just don't have the requisite skills. And that's why if you look at the sauna...
Through no fault of their own.
If you look at the sauna...
Let's be blunt about that.
What a fantastic evening. I will never forget 13 February. Because where in the world do you get a ticket to a circus, and then in the second half you have this brilliant sauna, where he announced his intention to create this youth service agency, where an unemployed youth can either go to register, get some form of vocational training, or get slotted into the entrepreneurship initiatives, or perhaps even get a job in the new city next to Lanseria. And can I tell you something? I'll take a side bet. That city is going to be constructed. It'll take a while, but it's going to happen. The difference between Mr. Ramaphosa and his policies that he's starting to implement, and Mr. Zuma, are like night and day. If you want to explain to a child what the meaning of paradox is, tell them Zuma, Ramaphosa, and they will understand.
Prince doesn't buy that.
Yeah, here's the thing about the 10.5 million. If you want, you said it's not their fault, and you're correct.
We've gone from 10.4 to 10.3 to 10.5. This is getting a bigger crisis by the minute. Yeah.
What is the machinery or the factory that reproduces these millions of unemployed black people? Let's be honest, these are black. It's because the African National Congress has collapsed public education. That's exactly what has happened. So we may need, by the way, to be drastic and say children of politicians must not go to private schools. Because if you were to look at the children of these ministers and these officials, they go to good schools in the private sector. So if you were to pass a law like that, let me tell you what would happen. The child of a councillor in a township would not go to a private school. You know what that would mean? It would mean that child must go to a local school in the township. It would be in the interest of the councillor to make sure that the principal, the teacher performs in the neighborhood school. That is what explains the 10.5 million unemployed South Africans. It's because you are right, they are unemployable because they have been processed through a dysfunctional education system that has been destroyed by politicians who have no interest in it, in ensuring that
and
it
the
functions.
trade unions. SATU. South African Democratic
right.
Research Union.
Can we
It's
get
public enemy number 3, next to the Reserve Bank and COSATU.
Wandile Sihlobo, I'll give you a moment to comment on that. But Kanti Pai, who's a young economist, he runs his own business called Nascence Advisory. Again, some of the most brilliant thoughts are the simplest thoughts. And he just goes, because government then goes, we can't create the jobs, so everybody must go and create their own small business. And Klanti's view on this is telling young people to create their own small business in South Africa is the cruelest hoax that you can play on them, because you're telling people who are not qualified to get a job that they must go and start a business. And then the DTI, the SIPS regulations, I don't know if you saw, there was a big furore around that. The SIPS regulations, treating small enterprises like corporations with chartered accountants and lawyers in their employ to comply with 20 pages of written documents. I mean, they've withdrawn that requirement now, but there's just no connection between reality, theory, and policy, unfortunately. Let's talk food security. Where are the locusts? Because that's the thing that scares me, Chris, right now, is that we've got these clouds of locusts the size of cities, that when the food is finished behind them, they only move forward and the wind is blowing in our direction. And I just heard somebody being very rude about the locusts a moment ago, saying they're getting closer and closer.
I think actually the farmers feel very similar to me. You know, you're talking about something which means nothing to them, to be quite honest. I think in a sense...
But it might mean nothing, but it has a direct impact, unfortunately.
No, but while this whole debate is going on, the farmer still needs to sit and worry about locusts, worrying about not having electricity for his pump station, worrying about the market not being there, worrying about the economy, you know, workers needs to be paid more. So I think the reality is, if you talk food security, all of this creates a huge amount of uncertainty. And that uncertainty filters through to the farmer on the farm. Whether you're a small-scale farmer that needs to get a product to a market, or whether you're a big-scale farmer, you sit with the same problem. And while you talk about food security, all of this has a huge negative effect on that. So economy of scale within the food security market is just going to reduce year on year if we don't address it. Now, government has identified agriculture as a huge potential employment opportunity, and it is. The reality is there's no planning behind it. So if you really want to do that, you need to put a 50, 100-year food security plan in place and work from there backwards to say, okay, what do we need in this area of South Africa? Because there are certain realities, there's certain areas in South Africa getting drier and drier. Can you produce certain products in those areas? So that's what I'm saying. From a farmer's point of view, yes, it's going to have some point of impact, Bruce, at some point in time. But at this point in time, they're not listening to that, because remember, there's a huge amount of goodwill created after 2017. A lot of that goodwill falters away because there's just no consistency in terms of the message to the farmer. And that's a broad, if you listen to 2 days ago, one of the big black farmers, he was saying for him land tenure is most important.
Yeah.
He wants to understand if he's going to invest in his land now, is he going to get that benefit in 20 years from now? Now, if you don't have that certainty, you can see investment in land reducing over the years.
Absolutely.
And that has a direct impact on food security. So we're talking about potentially 9 lost years under the Zuma government. We already had probably 2 or 3 lost years now. And we're not addressing things because they're not changing fast enough. And that's going to hit you at some point in time coming back to food security.
I mean, and is this now your new mission? This Wandile suggested that this is going to be, you're going to be the one-man band, food security band.
Look, I have a love for food security, I have a love for people, and I hope to make a difference in South Africa and hopefully in Africa as a result of that. By investing in areas and in companies can make a difference. The reality is still investment is going to need certainty of the environment that you invest in. Whether you do it as a single entity, whether you do it as an operational company, you want operational companies in South Africa in the ag space to invest, you know, in the food space to invest. You're not getting that. The reason why you're not getting that is because you don't have long-term tenure. You don't have long-term certainty of the environment. I
mean, these nice people at John Deere outside are going to sell you a combine for 10 million bucks, or tractors up to 8 million or thereabouts. I think possibly gone up a little bit since I last checked. I mean, you're not going to make that sort of investment in capital equipment if you don't know whether or not you're going to have a land to plow next year.
It's that on the one side, and obviously farmers have the ability to replace their farm equipment. So, if you go 10 years ago, farmers will replace equipment every 5 to 7 years. Now they would like to try and do that 3 to 5 years. But that will shift out again. And in fact, over the last years, it has shifted out again. So you do see farmers waiting a long time. We have a huge operation in Australia, the biggest John Deere dealer in Australia. And there you can see the replacement process from the farmers. The only thing that they focus on there is primarily weather and price of commodities. So as a farmer, those two things should be your prime focus. In South Africa, you have a variety of other things, whether you will have electricity, whether you will have land in 5 years, whatever the case may be.
I mean, are farmers being sufficiently rewarded for the risk that they're taking in order to keep on keeping on.
So remember, in South Africa, we don't have a support base for farmers from a subsidy point of view. We used to have that in the old days, talking about previous governments. I think, in a sense, the ADA under Roelof Meyer's leadership tried to get back to something in supporting farmers in general. If you look around the world, many places around the world, many governments actually support their farmers. So definitely, I don't think the farmers are getting the reward that they get, whether small-scale farmers or big farmers. The farmers are very much left up to their own ability to manage the market, and to manage the market within this variety of uncertainty.
Francis Fraser says there are many examples of land reform which are working. Why don't we examine these and share them in the public domain? I mean, the point is there is land reform happening, and there is a land reform that is being driven by, in many cases, the large-scale farmers in South Africa and their big family operations that are doing this. There are models which are usable.
There are models that's usable. There are models that's driven in South Africa, and a lot of those models primarily driven by private sector and obviously people like Grain SA. You need those models to be scaled if you really want to make a difference. Food security in Africa is around small-scale farmers. You need to get small-scale farmers to produce. You need to support the large-scale farmers so that they can continue to, use technology, increase their production. But you also need product to be exported. We're not going to create. If you produce 16 million tons of grain in a good year, 13, 12 million in a bad year, weather-wise. From a South African utilization point of view, in 20, 30 years, we're not going to have enough grain supplies in the country. So you need to look at that approach to say, how do you focus on that long term? Yes, we have these opportunities and these examples of successful land reform sessions. That's primarily driven by a lot of integration and a lot of support from private sector, and that needs to be scaled. Can't get away from that.
Wandile, I mean, we look at the agricultural sector. I mean, you've been tweeting recently and writing about the seasons and how, you get really worried December, January, oh, hell, it's getting dry, then there's a shower of rain, you're like a real farmer, and then suddenly your optimism levels go through the roof. You should get some land. And just give me a second, I mean, with all the politics and all of the stuff, it's hard enough putting millions of rand into the ground with absolutely no prospect of having a harvest 3, 4, 5 months from now. It's a hell of a process. I mean, the agricultural environment in South Africa, how do you see it from an economic perspective?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it links to the last point that Chris is making, because we have to be thinking really about the long-term side. Those provinces that I've mentioned, that's where the potential still lies on. But then the question is to say, how do you unlock that potential? You need some bit of investments to go in there, infrastructure to actually be in there, and all of those things. They, one way or another, again, need the political will, because you will have to transform fundamentally even the land governing system that is some of those areas in the long run. And I think those are some of the things that we should also be thinking about. But I think as conditions of now in the near term, in terms of the supply, I think South Africa is safe. But in terms as to whether the farmer is being rewarded in all of this, I think South African farmers are very in a difficult position.
Roelof, Botha, is AGOA at risk? The Africa Growth Opportunity, what's it called? AGOA? Africa Growth Opportunity? Act, thank you. Is it at risk? I mean, Mike Pompeo's statements yesterday suggested that the Trump administration is getting a bit fed up with giving Africa a free pass, particularly South Africa, if it's not going to play by global rules.
Yes, I'm quite nervous about that, to be honest. But perhaps we can sort it out in between SADC. If we can strengthen the SADC Secretariat in Gaborone, you're talking about an economic community which has a larger population than the United States of America. And for the life of me, I don't know why we are messing with BRICS. Our trade with Brazil and Russia, negligible, quite frankly.
Yep.
And India and China will trade with us anyway. They don't need BRICS to do that. I mean, these are one is already a superpower. The other one will become the biggest economy in the world. And we've got good relations with with India especially, right down to the miners. They're all over the show. So if they can strengthen the Secretariat in Gaborone, and especially with the logistics, I mean, there's fresh produce coming in and going out. That sometimes, ek het met Theo die Jager gepraat, Hy het een keer 'n vrag vol avokadopere gehad wat 4 dae daar gestaan het. Ek meen jy wil nie avokadopeer eet as hy eers so swart begin raak nie, né? Maar in elk geval. So I mean there's so much that we can do to facilitate the trade. I mean just within SADC. If we can within SADC as an economic community tell the Chinese we're going to slap a very, very small quota. Quota works much better than the tariff because you know exactly, immediately you know what the market size is going to be. You tell them we are going to import, let's say, R1 billion less T-shirts within the whole of SADC. Now your local manufacturers of T-shirts, they know exactly what the increment in the market is. That creates certainty because quite frankly, I mean, I just did the sums last night for my column in Beeld Burger en die Transvaal en die
Transvaalders dood. Lang tyd.
En Volksblad wat maandag verskyn, asseblief koop hom, hoor.
Have you got a translation?
About our trade balance and our trade deficit with China is unbelievable, you know. The Chinese won't feel it and you can literally create millions of jobs within SADC if we start looking at import replacement. There's so much that we can do. But in the Zuma era, you couldn't speak to them about it. Now, at least there's an open door policy. At least there is the Rolf Meyer and Van Zyl and his crowd and everywhere individuals that have got, the open door policy. They walk in and out of Ramaphosa's office and they talk about these things. But certainly I agree with Prince that he needs to beef up the skills level. And we shouldn't forget that within the ANC, you still have the two camps. I mean, that hasn't happened. Just because Ramaphosa became president doesn't mean that Mashele has seen the light. But Shamila Batoye wag vir hom. Sy gaan hom vat.
Ja, sy wag baie lank, hoor. Wandile, you want to add?
I think the point that Doc is mentioning is very important, particularly the trade one, because in all of the growth that we could see in South Africa in terms of production over the next few years, if we're not focusing on a trade story, the farmer will actually lose because of those lower prices. If you think now, for example, in value terms, we're already exporting about half of what we produce. So if you don't really nurturing those markets, we're not going to do well. And I think India and China are some of the exciting places. On agriculture, we are almost not there. They only buy, out of everything they buy, a year in South Africa is less than 0.5%. So I think focusing in there, focusing on expansion on labor-intensive industries, that's as important. And I think the high unemployed people that we talk about and we say they cannot be absorbed in certain industrial jobs, but I think agriculture has that capacity. And I think if we're focusing on those labor-intensive industries, putting up some certain incentives that can assist, easing up finance, which is what is being done here, I think that can assist.
Prince?
I don't know. You see, I've taken an interest in the history of white people in South Africa because when I look at all of them, without exception, when they got here, they were poor. You know, the 1820 settlers, you know, the problem of the poor white, and so on. If you look at the transition that they have made from that condition of being poor to where they are today, white people in South Africa are no longer poor. So if you were to remove blacks in South Africa would probably be one of the top 10 countries economically in the world. It's not in the main, it's not agriculture. So they have not been moving in the direction of agriculture. They've actually been moving away from agriculture as we hope it would create employment in South Africa. So the white people are not employed by agriculture. They are employed in sophisticated industries other than doing hard labor on the land. Why?
Not that hard.
Why? It is because over time they invested in improving the quality of educating their children. That's the core of it. Now, if you think that agriculture is the future of South Africa in the way in which we're talking about it, labor intensive, this and the other, let me tell you, you are lost. The 21st century, read Yuval Harari's book, right? That the biggest struggle of the 21st century is the struggle against irrelevance. So it's not a struggle against exploitation, max exploitation. There are no people to exploit labor. So what you need to do is to invest more and more in education so that our population becomes highly skilled, That's why we are driving Korean cars. Just walk outside, you'll see Hyundai, right? Kia. It is because those people have invested in high-tech education. I think that's the future. But of course, we need food. But the food is no longer going to be produced the way we think it's going to be produced in labor-intensive industry.
Wandile?
But Prince, the view here is not to say everyone should come to farming. You are sitting with supply of labor, which have not been trained well as we dealt with. Now the question is to say, what do you do to make sure that people are active somewhere? And in the near term, this is the industry that can absorb a certain proportion of those people. And now, how do we make sure that this industry flourishes and absorbs those people, while in the long term, you are thinking about developing and investing in education and doing all of that? But I think we are sitting with the immediate problem of saying, how do we solve it? And that's how farming come into play.
Before she falls asleep, Elmien, because you're also part of the conversation. Common sense. My grandfather, who farmed for 60 years, when the trouble with common sense is it isn't that common. Do we have common sense solutions to these problems? Because lots of people are giving me tips and ideas, from kibbutzes to lots of other things on here, and I'll get to those in a moment. But is there a common sense solution to what is a distinctly emotive political hot potato in a world where the reality of food security, the reality of people's really, really difficult lives has to be taken into account?
There is common sense. It's not in big supply. But I think, for me, from a legal standpoint, we have this constitution that guarantees rights. It guarantees food security. It guarantees at least unlawful intrusion on private property rights. It guarantees some form of redistribution. So we know these vague terms, but we don't color it in. And we can't color it in because you need input from politics, and politics is driven on ideology. So often people choose an ideological stance that's not in line with economics. So I think Wandile has been in quite of a turf war, whether the future of agricultural reform is large-scale farming or small-scale farming. Before we don't have a policy that set out what it is that we want to achieve, it's difficult to write laws about that. And you will see, I think, if my prediction is correct, the President's panel's report is sort of the way forward, and they will take bits and pieces out of it. But even that report is so contradictory at times. It's a fruit salad of ideas.
It's designed by committee, of course it is, yeah.
Some of these ideas are actually in conflict with one another, and we now need at least the policymakers to tell us we are going to focus on this and we are going to drive forward. We need the economists to put a price tag on that to say, is it affordable? And then the lawyers come in to write the laws. But it seems that at some stage, certain aspects, and at the moment it's the politicians, are taking over this conversation, is not actually sitting down and looking at evidence-based research of what can work and what cannot work.
And it goes to Nick Serfontaine's point, and Chris Burgess reminds me of this, saying that land reform has been solved. The models do exist across every farming discipline. The problem is that the state refuses to take the guidance.
And the state does not want private-public partnership.
But it says it does.
It says it does, but there's a lot of resistance, as I understand, to this idea of bringing private in, because there's this ideological block that private actually means that only a few people will benefit. And before we don't have that conversation of how, if that's true in the first place, and if that's true, how can you mitigate it by legislating or regulating it, we are not going to go anywhere.
I think sorry, Bruce, I do think that the issue is that in itself, but it's also broader, because remember, state has a problem in terms of funding. The reality is there's not enough funding to have all these public-private partnerships. So you get to a point where, yes, all these examples exist, but it needs to be an holistic approach. You need to get to a point where your borders are correctly controlled, where there's imports or exports. You need to get to a point where the people exporting or the people importing are well managed. So I think if you then get to an understanding of all these different examples that we've been talking about, and there's some funding for it. The small-scale farmer, whichever way you look at it, needs some sort of access to farming. Yep. They can't do that by security of land. So you need to have these models, and ADA is going to do a portion of that under Roelof, but there's so many other challenges that you need to address. And if you don't do it on a holistic approach to say, let's go through the full value chain of food security, you're not going to get there, because on one side, yes, you need to address the education, But education on a college basis, more so.
But can we go full on socialist about this? I'd like to see. Look at Prince; he's about to have a heart attack. Can we go full on socialist and we say government gives a whole bunch of land to cooperatives that are run in a public-private partnership with experienced farmers, kibbutz style. The members of the kibbutz share in the profits because we give profit in the socialist world, and there is some sort of form of activity and participation. Those are some of the themes coming through my Twitter feed. Don't hit me, Prince. I know you want to.
Yeah, look,
Don't shoot the messenger.
You want to take us to the past. And we know that that past didn't take societies anyway. Here's the thing. This whole thing about ideologies and so on is the 20th century stuff about socialism and capitalism and so on. In the 21st century, the basic question is, what works? What works? So we know, for example, that this idea of having a state that has a monopoly, complete monopoly over electricity does not work. That's why we are where we are now. So if you are Pravin Gordhan, you are a socialist, you think if we do this and that, you really, is this socialist?
He's a communist.
Of course he is.
Communists are nicer than socialists, I think.
And you are arresting society. So when it comes to land, we cannot be socialists. What we need to do is to make sure that land is in the hands of people who are going to farm productively in order for us not to run out of food. That's number one. Number two is to make sure that the people who have land in their hands reflect the demographic of South Africa, because the whole politics about land expropriation without compensation has got to do with the fact that if you look at the ownership of land, in the main, black people are not serious players in that space. So we need to address that. But the black people who go into that space, we must make sure that they have the skills and expertise to farm productively so that we don't starve. Because if you were to take a sample, by the way, the last point, of the ANC top leaders, do you know that they have farms?
Yes.
Yeah, they do. Cyril has a farm in Bethel.
He's been laying off people. He's been retrenching.
Gweta Mantashe has a farm in Kala. Mudise, the Speaker of Parliament, we know what happened to the pigs. If you were to look carefully at the leadership of the ANC, you'll find that these people have farms. But those farms are actually not benefiting society. These are vanity projects. And we have to make sure that the black people who go into farming are people who are real farmers and they are well trained.
How do we do this, though? Because, again, I'm making an assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but many of the biggest farmers in South Africa, white farmers, are third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation farmers. People who've been building up assets over generations, experience over generations. They grew up understanding the land and the soil and all that sort of stuff. Now you say to somebody, your career as an investment banker was really good, and now you can go and have a farm. They're going to fail. I don't care what color they are. You can have as much training as you like. It's either in your blood or it isn't, Wandile.
No, but I think now, I mean, Prince is right on his diagnosis of the of who should actually be getting on farming. And I think in our report also we reflected on those who monitor what government put out. There's a policy, for example, that went out at the beginning of this year, which is the farmer beneficiary selection criteria. Going forward now, which is what we argued for in the report at the time, that there must be a clear criteria on who gets to benefit on land, who gets to benefit on housing, who gets to benefit on land for industrial use. And I think they're beginning, at least on paper, it is there. Now the issue is about strengthening the institution to bring life in all of those things that the current administration is putting on paper.
Prince, you want to add to that?
The policy is new, Prince.
No.
I'd like to add something.
No, he's having a moment. Hold on. He's having a moment. No?
The thought is...
No, when it comes back, let me know. Prof?
Okay,
Doc?
getting back
Prof, Doc.
to
Are you Prof or Doc? Or are you both?
Both.
No, only Doc, actually.
But you're more Prof to me. I don't know, Prof is more Ernst.
That's not necessarily a compliment.
Is it not?
You know the
If I had a heart attack here, could you help me?
You know the
Then you're not a
definition
real
of
doctor.
of a philosophy professor? It's somebody who talks in your sleep. Anyway, back to the cooperative idea. I think that's a very good idea, and Theory Jager has done a lot of research on that. But, talk about missed opportunities. We need to start focusing on how do we get to solutions. Then we have a piece of legislation in South Africa which is little known, ULTRA, the Urban Land Transformation and Restitution Act. Now, if they just implement the damn thing, and if they don't have the skills, then get the skills, right? Then you can create title deeds for 4 million South Africans. The beauty of this is that then at municipal level, especially in the relatively large and more affluent municipalities, you immediately create a basis for property tax. I was in Mpumalanga recently, and they did an audit. I think they had about 150,000 properties that were paying property tax, average value in the vicinity of 1.5 million rand, I think. And then there was another 150,000 properties where the average replacement value of those properties were in the vicinity of 300,000-400,000 rand. They were not paying property tax. But they want services, but you don't pay property tax. Yeah. I mean, they must really start looking at this kind of stuff. We spend, as a nation, the average household spends more money on alcohol than on health and education combined.
Yeah, but we need to.
Yeah, fair enough.
Prince, you're back.
The thought has come back. We're right. It's about the point you made earlier, that this thing has to be in your blood. The generations. You are wrong.
Okay, tell me why I'm wrong.
Completely wrong. There is a company called Angloval. People may remember it.
Now AVI.
Exactly.
They make biscuits instead of expensive.
Look at the fellows who founded it. A fellow called Slip Menel and a fellow called Bob Herzog. They were succeeded by their children when these fellows died. But look at what their children went through. One of the children, the Menel child, was sent to Cambridge to study. The guy had an MA. There's nothing called this thing is in the blood. Yeah. You can train a person to master a craft. Black people can be proper trained farmers if they're subjected to training. If you look at your institution, by the way, before it became University of Northwest, Potchefstroom, right? It used to focus on the training of farmers, right? Of Afrikaner farmers. So they didn't say these kids, because they grow up on a farm, they don't need to go to school. No, they were subjected to training. So we can train black people to be proper farmers. They don't need to grow up under Afrikaner parents. So there's nothing is in the blood, it's training.
But where is this training going to happen? I mean, places like Sidara have been dramatically transformed. I mean, the Sidara used to be, I don't know what uniform they wear nowadays, but it used to be little white Natal farmers' sons in short khaki pants and stuff. Sidara now is a fundamentally different place. Where are all those people who have been trained in agriculture going?
I mean, I think the training nowadays is done largely by commodity organizations, because the truth is, a number of agricultural colleges and stuff that we had, they no longer are functioning at optimal standards.
Is that not a starting point then? I mean, agricultural colleges used to be the place where young farmers used to go to get trained.
Since 1994, they haven't performed in an exciting way. For a number of reasons. But I think the commodity organizations are doing a greater job now. But I think the benefit of the commodity organization as well is that you get more of a practical interaction with the farms, which is what this issue of private sector, public approach is so important, because there's a lot of a sharing of the know-how that happens into there. It's just that now the state or the government has to be open to that, and I think they're beginning to be open, at least on paper.
But where are we going to train a new generation of young black farmers? I mean, you need to be young because you need energy. Geez, that's hard work. How's that? Where are we got to start this thing? Because I mean,
I do think that. Sorry, Prince. I do think that there's a lot of training happening at the moment.
Where?
Again, there's not a governmental approach to training. You remember agricultural colleges in the old days, you have a lot of kids that grow up in the community. They go to agricultural college, they come back to the community and they live out and they train on the land. I think that combination is extremely important. We've seen it. We used to do a lot of training, and AFCRI still does a lot of training for people, but it takes you probably 5 years, if not longer, to get somebody who doesn't have that skill to actually take him to a self-sustaining farmer. And you need that patience, and you obviously need that support. So in those training programs, it's a very much intense mentorship program, support on land and also theoretical. You can't just send somebody to a college, and assume that he's going to be a farmer. You need that practical approach together with the transfer of skills from the farmer that's there. Whether it's a black commercial farmer or white commercial farmer, that happens. A lot of these training programs, we actually have the commercial farmers, supporting the neighbor farm in terms of doing harvesting or in terms of doing the right planning. Just as an example, we supported farmers going into Congo, Brazzaville. It took them probably 3 years to just work out which is the ideal time of the year to plant. So these are farmers that's been successful in South Africa just to know which part of the year do they actually plant. And I think that's the difference. In South Africa, if you miss that ideal season by 3 weeks or 2 weeks, it could cost you probably a ton a hectare. But those are the type of skills that you're not going to learn necessarily from an agricultural college.
No. Absolutely. So we need to talk about the economy. We need to talk about the broader economy. We can't just keep talking about land and land reform, although it's absolutely fundamental to everything that is going to happen in this economy in the next 5 years. We're part of a much bigger world, Dr. Botha, a much bigger world that is flying. The world is actually in a really good place. Global GDP growth is north of 3%. How worried should we be here in South Africa? One, about the locusts, which is more immediate perhaps than the coronavirus, but these are the black swan events, the things that we can't predict are going to happen until they happen. Do we need to be worried about these events, or does the world carry on ticking along?
Well, we obviously have to worry about them, but quite frankly, if you look at the fatality rate, then this latest one is not remotely as bad as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, and then the other one, the Serious Acute Respiratory Syndrome, SARS, which has the same acronym as SA Revenue Services, and they're both damn dangerous, quite frankly.
And one will kill you faster than the other.
I think the Chinese will sort this stuff out in a relatively short while.
The Chinese may sort it out, but it's in South Korea, and it's in Egypt, and it's in the little outbreaks all over the place, the little cruise ships that are becoming little petri dishes of excitement for people who are trapped.
It's not in sub-Saharan Africa, and as Trevor Noah said the other evening, it says, welcome to try. If it lands in the airport there, Ebola is going to say, I'll show you what a virus is.
But again, news media does overstate pandemics dramatically in their early stages, and we do then see an overstatement of these things. You're not worried about that as then a disruptor to the global economy, because we need markets. South Africa needs markets. China's a big market for South Africa. China's a big market for things like our iron ore and other commodities. This stuff matters.
Yes, it does, and the companies will take a knock. I'd like to use Kumba as a good example. I mean, they paid out 92% of their earnings to their shareholders. They don't seem to be too worried about the iron ore price, which has taken a small dip. Look at what gold has gone over 1,600. And we've seen what happened to Sibanye-Stillwater. I mean, this is unbelievable. In my wildest dreams, I didn't think that they would be making such a huge profit in such a short period of time. Once again, Neil Froneman is just in a league of his own. So I think the world economy will probably still grow at very close to 3%, and we need to look especially within our region, because our region is apparently forecast by the IMF to grow at between 3 and 4%. We're not so.
We're not really helping so much, are we?
No, we're not helping so much. But I am going to slip in some positives here, because if you take the second and third quarter capital formation, and as you've been talking about it, the tractor is capital formation. It's the assets that you need, without which you can't be productive. To a small builder, it's a cement mixer and a bakkie. To a consultant like myself, it's a laptop and a fast car. Apparently very attractive as well, because I keep getting pictures through the mail. But in any event, so capital
the fact that you get mail is a miracle, but yeah.
The capital formation in the second and third quarters compared to the previous 2 quarters increased in real terms by 18%. In 2019, we had the third highest inflow of foreign direct investment in our history. This is all the work of Ramaphosa and his new team. which is still unfolding. But remember, he's fighting a battle behind his back as well, with the Supras and the ISIS and these people. And they need to just beef up that office of the National Prosecuting Agency and start arresting more people. And the cabinet minister, previous one, has already been arrested. Yeah. So it's not as if nothing is happening. And quite frankly, Prince, I agree with usually about 99% of what you say. And I love your style and everything. But when you, in our opening remark, you said everything is collapsing, and that's simply not the truth. I mean, this country's GDP per capita...
No, he didn't say everything is collapsing. He's saying the ANC is imploding. The ANC is eating itself alive from the inside. And as South Africans, we have to work out how to survive the ANC, the ANC's implosion. I think that's a fair summary.
Let's go back to agriculture just quickly. The cotton industry, right? A public-private partnership, and I must disagree with my esteemed colleague here. Public partnerships are alive and well, and they are, in fact, practically being implemented at every municipal level in this country. It does work, but it needs a more decision-making power by the private sector aspect. So here comes a private-public partnership. 1,000 hectares of dry land cotton being planted 9 years ago, and today increased 20-fold. We've increased our production from 5,000 to 50,000 tons. We expect that to reach 80,000 tons in 2 years from now. That is a brilliant example of things that are happening.
Is it an isolated example or a general example?
No,
I think Elmien's concern is that it's not broad enough.
The motor industry development plan, we've had the one on the poultry. I mean, a CEO of a major listed company told me that for 7 years they tried to get an appointment with Rob Davies, like communist. En toe hy nou weg is, dank Vader,
yeah, but that same CEO will tell you that they can't get water in the municipalities in which they operate.
Patel realizes that, I'm being paid, let's do something about this, and he's a pretty bright guy. He phoned this guy and told him, let's sort out this chicken thing. And they're getting there. So really, things are happening. They're just happening too slowly, and quite frankly, I think we're being a little bit impatient.
Prince?
Okay, I don't care who walks in and out of Cyril Ramaphosa's office, so let's park that. You're talking about the global economy, right? If you look at the world now, you can see that where there is real movement in terms of building up of economic capacity, and that generates growth, and life there, it's promising. It's in East Asia. So the shift has moved from the West in the main towards East Asia. That's why the Americans are worried about China, right? They're not worried about any other part of the world. They're worried about China because China is now the second largest economy in the world. They're worried that it will overtake the US. If you look at the countries in that region, Southeast Asia, there's movement there. Now, those countries have something that they do. They say, here is the world. Where will be our role in the long term? What are we going to sell to the world in the long term? That kind of stuff, it's not happening in Cyril Ramaphosa's head. It's not happening at all. I don't care who walks in and out of his office. So if you look at South Africa, over the past 100 and 150 years, we have in the main been the exporter of raw materials to the world, right? So if you talk about the profits that mining companies are making, it continues that trend. The question is, will we sustain ourselves over the next 50 to 100 years on the basis of that model? My answer is no. If my answer is correct, is there a niche that we have identified as South Africans of things we are going to manufacture here and sell to the world? The answer is no. So I don't care about the statistics that people brandy about the last quarter and the next quarter. I'm asking a strategic question. Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't answer it.
Roelof Botha is going to respond to that in a second. Wandile and then Roelof.
No, I'm going to respond to that. I moonlight as a member of Economic Advisory Council to the President. To say those ideas are not discussed there is not correct. No, it's not correct. There's a number of us there. We are dealing with the issues of disindustrialization. We have only been there for a few months, Prince. We are dealing with the issues of the energy crisis. There are people that are looking onto that. There are people looking at the labor-intensive industries. There are people looking at the inequality story and working with various ministries. All of this is the work that started about 3 weeks or so beginning on to working on these things. So the ideas are there, but what is going to be important now is to say, how do you bring life in what is on the paper? And that is not going to be done by the South African government alone. We know about the capacity issues that constrain the state, but now we're going to have to bring in the business as well. And I think globally, yes, the world is growing well. South Africa, over the past decade or so, we have been getting poorer, growing less than the population growth. Now it's about how do we speed up all of that which we want to do so that we can benefit from that global growth that is actually happening now. And the issues of the viruses that you are raising, I mean, no one knows how the impact of this is going to be, but I think the world economy is still sitting on, and the IMF chief economist was speaking right in your studios last night saying they are relatively comfortable that growth is strong. But now let's solve our domestic issues, but the ideas are there, I think so.
Roelof?
Yes, I mean, it's totally incorrect to say that we haven't identified sectors that we're good at. In processed food, several industries, in agriculture, in high skills, high technological markets, we outperformed Australia on the scientific scores for the AKA by a very long shot. But you'd expect that. I mean, it's Australia and so on. And last year we had an all-time record for vehicle exports. There are people in America that are driving Mercedes-Benz cars made in East London.
But I think
Prince's
point is we're very good at manufacturing other people's stuff. We're very good at doing stuff for others. But if I have to hear another government minister saying, you know what we really need to do? We need to beneficiate our own minerals. But it's the stuff that we have to get going. And to Wandile's point that we're starting, and it's depressing that we're starting because South Africa was growing. I mean, South Africa had a good industrial base. South Africa had a fine base from which to build, and it's kind of stopped. And now we've got to restart again, 25 years behind the rest of the world.
That's, Bruce, are building in those capacities. I think there is a lot of work that is beginning to actually get in there. But to absolutely say there's nothing is happening, no, it's not a clear judgment of the...
He wants to fight with you, which is good.
Here's the thing about it. You see, I'm not interested in poetry. I'm interested in practical things that I see. So if I look at a small country, by the way, it's not even half our size, it's not even a quarter of our size, called South Korea, for example. Little, tiny, like island country, if you like. You don't need to come up with poetry and say we are discussing and so on. You will see their products on the road. You will see their products in your pocket, a thing called Samsung. It's all over the world. That's what I'm talking about. The economists of the future are not the ones who spend long time discussing the stuff you are discussing, I don't know where. Are those who make things and sell to the world. That's how Southeast Asia has overtaken many parts of the world. That's what I'm interested in.
They may have had some discussions before they took over the world, though. I mean, they may have planned it a little bit.
It starts with an idea.
Mercedes-Benz, we know, and BMW and all of Volkswagen, we know that story. It is an old South African story. There's nothing new about it, by the way.
Yeah, but it's there. It's there. And by the way, we're a regional superpower. And I want to take it back to SADC. If this government has, common sense, as you say, is in short supply, they would work all out to strengthen the logistics and the cooperation within SADC. Because here you have a market of 320 million people who every day eat, they get dressed, a lot of them get into their cars and so on, and we need to produce that. And I agree with you. I mean, in 88, Mintech had an absolutely brilliant plan. I mean, it was a thing like this, which I read through. It took me quite a while.
That's why nobody else bothered.
How to beneficiate every single mineral that we produce in South Africa. And when and it was just lying there, and then came the ANC was unbanned in 89, and the focus shifted to Kudesa at the World Trade Center, which is now a casino. Isn't that ironic? And then obviously, and then they changed the street names. So Charles Street became something else. And I don't even want to know what it is, because that's easy to do. But to implement, and they threw out all the ideas. And now they're starting to dust off that. So we've certainly lost a bit of time. But I want to put my faith in Mr. Ramaphosa and the new team that he is slowly but surely building and strengthening the compacts that he's talking about. It's going to take some time, but I think we are on the right road. We have started moving in the right direction.
Chris, can you, from a practical perspective, share Roelof's optimism? Because you look somewhat circumspect, hopeful but circumspect, if that's not a contradiction.
Look, what I know is the most difficult thing to change in any organization and in government is culture.
Yep.
And I think the problem that we deal with is we struggle to shift the culture from what we had. And we also need to remember, from a young government point of view in the late 90s, there was a big focus on almost continuing with the things that worked. And unfortunately, in the first 20 years, we didn't get the land reform correct. We didn't get a lot of things correct, which wasn't built on. And instead of the last 9 years building new culture and expanding on that momentum, we lost that momentum. Now we have a very difficult culture in government and one needs to remember, if you have a negative leader, that leadership negativity will flow through, whether it's corrupt or whatever, into the organization. So you deal with a much deeper problem than just changing the leader. And to change that culture is going to take time. So I agree with Wandile and with Roelof, but I'd also agree that we should see changes faster. So your perception should be, or your context should be, that we have 9 years to make up. And in the
or 25 years to make up.
Or 25 years to make up in many things.
50 years to make up, yeah.
We all would like to see change much faster. We all would like to see those niche products coming out, where agriculture is one. That should be getting all the attention it can, because potentially it can make a huge difference. We're not seeing that. So in a sense, from Prince's point, I fully agree. Those changes should be there. We should think of what are we going to drive, what is going to be the mining product that we had the previous 100 years that we're not going to have now.
There's something called Hazenile, which I heard about the other day. There was a mining conference in Australia, and Gwede announced Hazenile. And that goes to the problem, I suppose, about a juniorification and a lack of experience and the dumbing down of the state. I mean, so many great people have left the state simply out of sheer frustration. And
it's true, but there's a lot of great people still coming back, and a lot of great work being done, as Wandile is referring to. Is that change of culture, the change of momentum is just taking time.
It does. I mean, you're so quiet, and I worry about you. So, I mean, can we speed up the success of the state? Can we legislate smarter, better, into a position where government is able to get out of the way of progress?
So I think the past 25 years, we've had really good legislation that enabled the government to do land reform and to do it in a way that's within the rule of law, within the constitutional framework, but it just didn't happen because there was not the political will to do so. So I'm listening to this conversation with interest. I mean, that culture, that's just not there to implement what we already have, and we do have good laws. So from a legal point of view, it gets quite frustrating because we have what we need to in order to implement meaningful land reform, but we have no idea of forcing the government to do it. So we cannot force the government to implement it. So from where I sit, the only thing that you can still add to these laws is to get a way for government to do it within the means that it has. What I meant also, just to get back to the private-public partnership thing, as an example, there are many farmers who call me and say, we would really like to donate land, but in order to donate land to some of the farm workers, we need to subdivide it. So there's a legislation that bypassed the Subdivision of Agricultural Land Act for land reform purposes. It just requires a signature from an official to subdivide the land. So that person wants to do private land reform, if I can call it that, and he just needs the signature of a DG or a MEC or somebody, and they're just not signing these documents because they say, you are only going to benefit 4 people and we want you to put communities on the 4 parcels that you want to subdivide. So, and then we get back to the ideology, what is the vision for agriculture that we have? And until there's not somebody that makes a definite decision of what it is that we see that comes in with your forward-looking planning, it's going to be difficult to devise ways of implementing it. We don't have a land audit. We don't know how the land is. Yeah. So all these things makes it difficult from a legal perspective.
Okay, so if we can't do it economically, we can't do it legally, we can't do it practically, can we do it ideologically, Prince? Can Cyril Ramaphosa have his JFK moment? Can he, like 1962, JFK stands up and he doesn't say to Americans, guys, it's really difficult and it's probably impossible. But you know what, if we can, just please, can you make just try really hard? Let's get to the moon by 1969. JFK doesn't do that. He paints a vision and a picture. Cyril Ramaphosa tried that in his first or second State of the Nation address with bullet trains and smart cities and stuff, and he missed he missed the tone of the country at that particular point. But is there a way for a political leader like Cyril Ramaphosa with credibility to stand up and to empower the official to sign the document that allows us to move just 1 inch in the right direction? They're constantly doing 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, because that sort of feels like we're doing at the moment.
Well, in America, they have a presidential system, so an individual can stand up and promise a whole lot of things, and he has space to appoint his ministers from wherever. He can just come and collect you and make you a minister. It's allowed in America, not in South Africa. In South Africa, you're run by a party. So Cyril Ramaphosa, whatever he says, he goes back to Lutula House. A gangster called Ace Mashele tells him, you can't do that in the ANC. That's South Africa's problem. But even with that system, and I've lost hope with Cyril Ramaphosa, by the way, so I don't want to enter wherever he is. Even with that, our political system, if you have a president who understands power, you can fix this. South Africa is a little thing. Look at China. It's a massive thing. It was fixed by Deng. They also had a Communist Party there. Cyril Ramaphosa, what he should have done over the past year or so. Number 1, he should have shaken the tree in order for the monkeys to fall. How? You get all these criminals, we see them at the Zondo Commission, right? They are not running around. At least by now they should be shuttling between their house and courtroom. They are not. So he has told those criminals by not acting that they can gang up against him. He's lost the momentum. So he hasn't arrested, there are no serious people who have been arrested. So he has lost that. If you lose the war on criminality, you will never win the war on the economy. Never. Because the logic of institutions, it's that of thieving. I mean, let's be honest about it. The logic of South African state institutions as we speak is that of stealing. It's not that of building a country. Cyril Ramaphosa has completely missed the opportunity. People who are shuffling into his office and out of his office, they have this illusion that things are changing. But let me tell you, the criminals are ganging up. And watch the space. He may not get a second term. And what happens if the guy were to be run over by a car? Look at the ANC. Would you like your children's future to be in the hands of that bunch? Scary.
On that happy note. Okay, I think that was your close. If you got anything else to say, that's fine. Are you happy with that being your close? Good close, strong close, emphatic close. Roelof, would you dare to counter in 30 seconds?
If you look at one of the other green shoots that I've identified, the unbelievable upward trend in short-term insurance premiums. Who has a car?
How's that a green shoot?
I mean, that doesn't happen if people are not buying assets, Bruce, quite frankly.
No, it happens in a
Right?
system. Oh, no, that's not fine. It's only 30 seconds. You carry on.
We still have investment-grade status for our bonds. It may not be for long, but then it
Okay,
seems to
downgrade
be-
happens. Downgrade comes not in March, but possibly by September. Moody's goes, okay, we're fed up. Ons is gat vol. It's over now. You are now sub-investment grade. We have been for a long time, but now finally they acknowledge it.
Okay, on an index-based level, I've compared the last 8 years what happened to the Brazilian real and the South African rand, and they've tracked each other almost one-on-one. And what happened when we had that Minister of Finance for a weekend only? That was quite a special one. And then he was fired.
Des, yes?
And we had a president that told the world that he is going to work at the BRICS Bank. And then a journalist phoned the BRICS Bank and said, "Oh, we don't know anything about this." But anyway, at the same time, that was the end of 2016. Brazil gets downgraded to junk. What happens? Theory says that your bond yield should shoot up and your currency should depreciate. Exactly the opposite happened. Exactly the opposite. And when Pravin Gordhan was reinstated as Minister of Finance, the same thing happened to our currency. Yeah. And quite frankly, right now, I think it's already been discounted. What we need to do is to start implementing the shovel-ready projects. Mr. Ramaphosa managed to secure in November last year, it's a couple of months ago, 363 billion rand of new investments in capital formation. And the infrastructure fund is now as strong as that. It has 700 billion rand in place. We do need the skills. We need to move a little bit faster, but I disagree wholeheartedly with Prince. I think we are slowly but surely moving in the right direction. Let's hope Mr. Ramaphosa doesn't get run over. But he has...
A cousin of mine nearly did drive over him the other day in the street in Melrose where they both live. So it was close. It was it would make Prince happy. Elmien,
My 30 seconds.
you can have a minute.
So I think it's important to remember that rights in terms of the constitution, but also in terms of legislation, it comes with price tags. So I think it's very important for lawyers to interact with economists to ensure that the rights that we promise in lofty speeches in SONA, in the amendment of the Constitution, if it happens, in the policies that come or the legislation that is actually, our focus should be on the legislation, not on the Constitution, that comes with a price tag that's affordable. And if it's not affordable, that we devise plans on how the government and the private sector can work together. But I think for that to happen, we need to leave the politicians out of this conversation.
Oh dear, well that's so therefore it's not going to happen. Wandile?
I think, in closing, one of the things I would say is that we are definitely in extraordinary times in as far as the economy is concerned. I wouldn't, by any chance, try to underplay that. But I think amongst the many interventions that are being done, one of the important areas which we are not talking about it a lot, or we should be focusing on it a lot, is really empowering and strengthening the local governments. Because if the local government systems are not in place, as we are seeing, particularly those of us who are in agriculture, as well as the broader other institutions that we are beginning to see work on, if those are not intact and those are not empowered, much of what we discuss and economists write on papers and put it out there is not going to be implemented. So local government, many work that Chris and the colleagues are going to be doing, if those local government institutions and local government offices are not empowered, we're gonna stay in these areas for quite some time, unfortunately.
Chris, you started. I'll let you finish.
Thank you, Bruce. I think, we need to embrace the goodwill that's there. There's a huge amount of goodwill from private sector to support and to make changes. We have to continue to be patient and continue to engage and use that goodwill and make a difference. That's why we're here. And if we don't do it, then certainly, 10 years from now, our children will have a problem.
And it comes down to mindset. It does come down to what we prepare to fight for, how we prepare to fight for it, how we prepare to work for it as well. And we can either wait for government to get off its backside and take action and do stuff, or, frankly, the sort of activity that we do see happening, and it's been spoken about here over the last 2 days and into today as well, where people are taking big steps and decisions themselves within the legal frameworks to make positive impacts on South Africa. It's huge. And you talk about culture and organizations. Just to wrap up with a thought from Laurie Dippenaar, one of the 3 founders of the First Rand Group. And I said to him, so you didn't ever make quick acquisitions. And it was a time when EOH was making quick acquisitions, and we see how that's turned out. It was a time when Steinhoff was making quick acquisitions, and we see how that turned out. And he says, you don't make quick acquisitions in business. You don't go for the quick wins. When they bought FNB, it took them 10 years to change the culture of FNB into more of a First Rand culture. And that's just, you employ 30,000 people across 500 branches across the country, and it takes you 10 years to do that. Culture is hard, but it's the only thing ultimately that really matters. Ladies and gentlemen, please could you give a very warm round of applause to these very smart and lovely people. Thank you very much indeed.